Good afternoon, everyone. I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with many of you that are on the call today. But for those that are newcomers, welcome. My name is Joe Doherty. I'm Senior Director of Communications at FDD, a nonpartisan research institute focused on national security and foreign policy. We're grateful that you've taken the time today to join us. We know that your schedules are busy. As we preview a new FDD report to be released tomorrow, on an overlooked cybersecurity problem, attacks on firmware. Our two experts today are well versed on this issue. First, we'll have Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, retired. He is an FDD Senior Fellow and Senior Director of FDD Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. Mark also directs CSC 2.0, an initiative that works to implement the recommendations of the congressionally mandated Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where he served as executive director. Also with us today is Michael Sugden, a research analyst and editorial associate at FDD CCTI, where he works on issues related to nation-state cyber threats, critical infrastructure protection, and U.S. cybersecurity policy. Before we get started, a few quick housekeeping things. Today's conversation will be on the record. We are recording it, and we'll share the transcript of today's call within 24 hours, hopefully sooner than that. Today's run of show is as follows. First, we'll hear from Mark. He'll set the table, and then Michael will address the key findings of the report. Then we'll open it up to your questions and answers. During the Q&A portion, you may submit your questions either via chat or by using the raise hand feature, in which case we'll let you know when you've been unmuted and are good to go to ask your question. Okay, let's get underway. Mark, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Joe. And thanks. Good to see a lot of the people I've worked with out here on the cybersecurity issues in the past on the line. And glad to be here with Michael. Michael was a intern for us about a year ago, or a year and a half ago, and then we hired him less than a year ago to work issues. And I think you'll find his work very useful. So look, I'm going to be honest, firmware, how boring can we get? I mean, it's an area of little interest. I can say that I successfully authored or supported like 45 pieces of cyber legislation in the last 3 years without having to mention the word firmware once. It turns out that's bad. I didn't really realize it until working on this report with Michael. And when we think about emerging technology with China, we tend to think of like the really Gucci cool stuff like drones and DJI or 5G and Huawei or LiDAR, and vehicle, self-driving vehicles, or even cloud and, network centers. But I'm going to tell you right now, firmware is an area we need to be really worried about. When you think about how you can get, firmwares, and Michael will talk exactly about what it is, but how it gets attacked, is just the normal ways. You can either have poorly written code, you can have someone penetrate your supply chain, you can have someone mess with a patch, as it's being installed, or finally you can have someone physically get involved with the firmware on your device. The bottom line is it's been used by Russia and China in its war against Ukraine, but even before its war against Ukraine in 2016, again, in damage to the electrical power grid. So our adversaries definitely have been thinking about firmware. And just to say, it's not my bad legislation. CHIPS and Science Act, which mentions cybersecurity in a software or hardware context over 250 times, says the word firmware once. And the problem is, if you're doing this work and you're saying, where are we going to put the R&D money, and you don't use the word firmware, it doesn't go to firmware. If you're using this work and you're thinking about what are the guardrails for funding for these grants, and you don't mention firmware, it won't be part of the guardrails. So the bottom line is we have not been, firmware makes us, vulnerabilities in firmware places at risk. They're attackable for a lot of the same devices, and they're not being dealt with. And the final thing I'd say is that, in the Cyber Solarium Commission, we talked a lot about having to have a more healthy ecosystem, cyber ecosystem for everyone. And we didn't, I would say, one of our less successful areas in terms of getting legislation done, to me, or executive branch work done, to me, addressing firmware would really go a long way there. And this firmware is right alongside the cyber trust mark, which is another recommendation of our commission that the National Security Council is pretty aggressively put in, the administration is pushing right now. But you can see that, we're starting to understand that working that ecosystem is important. So from my perspective, Michael's work is a nice piece to kind of set up the problem with firmware, give you some examples of how crap went wrong, and then give you some recommendations on how we can get well. And I hope you guys take some interest in this, because I think this is an issue that needs that kind of like flare of attention applied to it. So Joe, that's my opening thoughts on it.
Copy that. Thanks, Mark. Michael, over to you.
Great. Thanks, guys. Just to start off, I got to push back. Mark says it's not, or it's the most boring topic ever. I think it's so interesting, as I've been working on it for the past few months. Hopefully you guys will share my sentiment. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page of what the definition of firmware is, I'll start with a quick little description. So firmware is the code that it's serving as the link between a device's hardware and software. So this is constantly communicating back and forth, and is necessary from the function of pretty much every device, from a supercomputer to a smart light bulb. An example of this in motion is if you press a power button on your computer, it's the firmware that's telling your actual device that you've done that physical stimulus. So it's communicating that link. This happens across every piece of hardware, from your keyboards to cameras to microphones, so on and so forth. So you might begin to imagine that if a hacker can get control of these crucial links, some pretty bad stuff can start to happen. Like Mark mentioned, firmware security is a really serious issue, and it's one that's been getting significantly worse. We've seen a big spike in firmware attacks since roughly 2019, and these attacks are more niche compared to software attacks. We do see fewer of them, but hackers have started to realize that there can be more bang for your buck in firmware attacks. And this is because firmware attacks are often harder to detect and harder to remove than their software or cyber attack counterparts. Going off this, so your device's antivirus scan a lot of times can only detect malware at the software level, which leaves firmware completely in the dark. If a hacker can get in there, you may not know till it's too late, or even at all. If you do find out, even a full hard drive wipe may not remove malware in your firmware. So as for how hackers get into the firmware, Mark kind of touched upon that a little bit. It's important to note that it's typically more difficult than corrupting software, but this usually means that it takes more sophisticated cyber actors to carry out these firmware attacks, and we are most often attributing them to nation state or nation state backed groups. And going through kind of just quickly what Mark mentioned of how they can get into your firmware and corrupt firmware, which our memo goes much more in depth into. They can exploit vulnerabilities in bad code. They can corrupt it at any point along the supply chain, and they can hijack over-the-air updates, or even gain physical access to the device itself. These can be prevented with extensive safeguards and best practices, but oftentimes firms choose to leave these out in favor of cutting costs. So if a hacker manages to get into the firmware, these attacks can have some serious, really, really devastating impacts. They can range from, file extraction, spying, taking control of your device, or even completely disabling it. And these attacks are happening. One big one was the Viasat modems at the beginning of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. They were hacked by Russian hackers, and they're believed to have infiltrated Viasat's supply chain, and were able to push malware that completely wiped over 30,000 modems. All these modems needed to be completely replaced. They couldn't just be patched through an update. The firmware attack cut out internet access for tens of thousands of customers, some of which were without internet for over 2 weeks, which was devastating at any time, but especially at the beginning of an invasion. If we're not careful, an attack this destructive, or maybe even worse, can affect us. So that's why our memo really provides these 5 recommendations on how to get the ball rolling on enhancing firmware security. I'll go into 3 of the more pressing ones now, just because these are the big, the big ones that our paper wants to lead with. So, like Marcus mentioned, the government hasn't really brushed upon firmware security, and it's completely neglected it from its secure by design frameworks, specifically CISA's secure by design framework that they released in 2023. And it kind of begs the question: how secure can a device really be if we forget an entire type of code? So firmware security really must be included in CISA's Secure by Design framework, and it needs to be considered at every point in the Secure by Design decision-making process, or else we're leaving our devices at significant risk. And Mark also mentioned the cyber trust mark. This kind of goes hand in hand with that. If we're having these policies like the cyber trust mark that should tell consumers, hey, this is great, this is secure, or at least taking security best practices, they should know that it's not just software, it's everything. So next, the document that provides the best practices for firmware security desperately needs to be updated. This document is NIST 800-193 and was written in 2018 before we've seen this big recent surge in cyber attacks on firmware. So new information that researchers have learned from finding these cyber attacks should be included, and the writing also predates the software bills of materials, or SBOMs, and a lot of the recent work on those, which can help catalog firmware supply chains and determine where any vulnerabilities may have gotten in. So these changes can make the document a lot more robust and effective at securing your devices. And the third major one is in the same vein. Even if we do improve this document and improve our frameworks in general, we really need to ensure that firms are actually following these documents. So right now, compliance is completely voluntary, and companies may ignore it in favor for cutting costs, like I mentioned. We should incentivize compliance through carefully targeted tax breaks, allowing firms to write off transition-related expenses, or giving compliant firms priority in government contracts. And these should be mostly geared towards critical infrastructure owners and operators, since there's a disruption in their service can directly impact the lives of numerous Americans. Obviously, it sucks if your phone gets hacked, but it's a lot bigger if the switches that are controlling the flow of electricity to millions of homes are shut off. So that's pretty much what I have as a summary. Joe, back to you.
Thank you, Michael. We've got some questions that are coming in, but the first one, I'll take the first one. I'm seeing that this could be a problem for three areas that our participants on the call will care about. One is consumers. Two is the administrative state, if you will, either state or federal agencies, Senate office buildings, whatever the case is. And then third, DoD. Mark, you were, head of a carrier group. So can either of you or both of you address maybe some of the concerns that you have for any of those three or all of those three, if they should be concerned about the firmware attacks?
Well, look, I'll just start. I think Michael did a pretty good job on this. I'll say that I think the attack surface is everywhere, right? I mean, I suspect there's a few systems not connected to the internet that don't do upgrades to their OT operating, extremely limited, less than 1% of all networks that don't operate on firmware and need firmware to be adjusted on occasion, right? So I think we're all vulnerable. The question is, and on a lot of software things, you say to yourself, well, look, if an installation's inappropriate, I have other anomalous activity detection running on the system that'll detect it, right? If there's a problem in some of my software or hardware, I can be running some other application that'll solve this problem. In firmware, that's not true. In firmware, if they get in there and there's malware installed, literally it's in the boot up. And the first thing it says is, under no circumstances, look underneath the hood to look for this malware, right? I mean, in other words, it creates the conditions where if the malicious install is in the firmware, you're cooked. So firmware's got to be one of these things with a zero trust policy assigned to it, or really a zero defect, right? You have to know that it was built properly. It's secondary and tertiary supply chain, it was right, through SBOM or some other initiative, that any patching of it was thoroughly vetted, and that someone can't get physical access to it to make those changes. So that's a lot of steps that have to be done on firmware, and they have to be done, I think, if you want to be secure, to a zero defect level. And so, that to me, everyone's at risk, and everyone needs to take those steps.
Michael, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, not to beat a dead horse, but like Mark said, this really does affect everybody. Firmware is in pretty much every single device that you can think of. And like I mentioned, these attacks aren't super easy to execute. They are more difficult. So these aren't just kids in their basement trying to prank you. Usually, these are big actors who can get into stuff and really corrupt a lot of stuff. So it should absolutely be taken seriously because it can affect anyone from a kid on an iPad to top government facilities.
First question that we have that comes in from Jacob at Inside Cybersecurity. He asks, a key part of this memo is creating incentives for firmware security. Are there any bills that have been introduced or bills that are being worked on currently that would create incentives for using secure firmware?
So this is Mark. Yeah, not yet. And that's a great question. Usually when we do these policy memos, we produce, suggested or draft legislation with it. We haven't done that yet because first we want to get an idea on how NIST 800-193 is being rewritten. And once we get, and we think that the biggest step is that, and here's a real challenge. NIST, as you guys all know, everyone on this call knows, every time the NSC or CISA or somebody or DHS says, I'm fixing this problem in cybersecurity, every executive order, it says NIST shall. And then you kind of ask hey, what's NIST budget? Because what I found is the president's budget for NIST, it's not flat, but it has not reflected the assignments he has given it over the last 3 years. And I can go back 4 or 5 years. This is not a singular administration issue. NIST cybersecurity budget, if left to the druthers of the administrations, would be relatively flat. Now, Congress has added money in, but not near enough for all these taskings. So I'm really afraid that the 800 series, the kind of iterative process that's needed to keep the 800 series relevant, hasn't been happening. And you can see this here. This 6-year-old NIST 800 series is in crying need for upgrade. Once you get that upgraded, you understand what the requirements are. I think then you can sit there and write, okay, based on that, here's how you might be able to incentivize people making these investments, because a lot of this firmware is baked in. It's all baked in, but it's you accepted it's highly likely that 5 and 10 years ago you accepted a much greater risk in your cybersecurity of that firmware than you're willing to take today.
Got it. Thank you, Mark. Joseph from Politico asks, can you go a bit deeper on establishing a national repository? What might that look like?
So a national repository could be a set of known threats to firmware. Currently, we don't have anything like that for firmware. So something that IT specialists or risk management specialists can look back to and say, like, oh, this happened for this company X amount of years ago. Now it's easier to access. I'm not starting from the ground up. Because a lot of these companies that are being hacked, they don't have super extensive IT teams that are able to just pull everything out of their brain. So it would just help these IT specialists just keep pushing forward.
Got it. Thank you, Michael. Question that I have, Mark, you did mill to mill.
Can I pick up on one thing on Joseph's question? Yeah. One of the things is probably what Michael should have added onto there is that we kind of think CISA, in the absence of anyone else. I don't want to just say CISA because CISA is the answer to any question about cybersecurity, but I think legitimately CISA would be the right place to establish and maintain this repository. I don't think I don't think this is a heavy lift for them, and I think it would be a good place to start. One of the other things I'll say is, there's only, I think, Michael, correct me on this, there's like 8 companies doing 95% of the work, something like that in this field. So we're not asking them to like maintain like the Rosetta Stone of firmware, right? I mean, I think this is a manageable task, but what it is highlighting people. What scares me is like, we all talk about 0 days, like, because we see them, the group of us have all seen quite a few 0 days exposed by China and Russia over the last few months. they don't need to use a 0-day in firmware. We're finding a lot of known flaws are not patched for a lot of different reasons. And so, my take is having a repository you can go to know what to look for when you're doing like an assessment, to support like third-party assessors who I don't think do near as much work in firmware as they do in the software and hardware when they're going through networks would be helpful. If some other FFRDC or something were to maintain it, that'd be fine. But in the absence of that, CISA. Sorry, Joe, I just wanted to jump in on that. You're up.
Thanks, Mark. Actually, it gave time. So David has reached out. He asks, based on the report, it appears this has gone unnoticed for a bit of time. Mark, can you weigh in on that? Why has the Biden administration not explored this further? And I'll personally add, you mentioned it's a multi-administration issue. Back to the question, Mark, can you discuss how this issue, and Michael jump in as well, how this issue first came to attention at CSC? So,
and Mike could add in on this, but look, I don't think this was a common attack vector. The Biden and Trump administrations are kind of like, when it comes to cyber, we're kind of like firefighters with like 10 3-alarm fires going on simultaneously. They're just running around with their heads cut off. And my guess is firmware was never, the flavor of the day. I think what's happened is we're starting to see more and more firmware, and maybe that's a compliment to the efforts to make software cybersecurity, more resilient, right? Or cybersecurity software more resilient. We're now seeing the adversary look for other attack vectors. I'd say another one, this isn't a great criminal one. I mean, you could extract information, intellectual property, things like that. This is probably not the greatest tool for criminal behavior. I think it is a very good tool for intellectual property. Got her interest. So I'd say those two things coming together, the increasing use of it as a threat vector, to culminating in Viasat, and then Suzanne Spalding. I don't want to, she definitely, I think Michael was an intern at that time when she brought it up, and that got us thinking about it. And then we, started writing about it.
Yeah, the Ukraine, I mean, talk about being timely. Is that an example then of how a nation state could successfully use firmware attacks against another nation state, such as?
So that's what I was talking about, disruption, right? It's a great disruptor tool, and so it's useful. Again, I don't want to get proven wrong with like a firmware attack tomorrow used by a criminal to take millions of dollars, and like, what do you know? I mean, certainly it could be used as a tool, but right now, if I were running a criminal enterprise, I'd wake up in the morning and kind of like a real estate person, I'd be like ransomware, 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 right? I'd be like, that's how I'm going to make my money. And this just isn't, that kind of tool. This is a great disruption tool, I think. You have root access basically to a network, and you can probably cause a heavy disruption. It's not as useful as a tool to navigate for theft purposes or for criminal activity, but it's definitely a great disruptor. And that's what they did in how many, I want to say 20,000 plus, right? Modems in
30,000 plus. So
how many?
Over 30,000.
Over 30,000. So, in the Viasat attack, I mean, that's a pretty aggressive disruption. And as most of you know, had Elon Musk not showed up with Starlink, and had the Ukrainian army not probably inappropriately operated off of cell phones as a backup, they would have been in a real hurt locker. If they, with the loss of Viasat. So, from my perspective, that's how we got to that point, Joe.
Michael, do you want to flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like, I think Mark has it exactly right. Something that we want to talk about and show with this firmware memo is that, sure, firmware attacks aren't, they're not like what Mark said. They're not the ransomware that we all care about right now. But if we completely, flush out software and that's all perfect, and we don't look at firmware at all, hackers will get a step ahead and they will pivot and they will figure it out. This isn't, the chicken with its head off, but it's something that is there too, and we need to figure it out now.
Hey, Joe, I know we're not getting new questions in. One of the things, if I could add something on here,
Please
just
do.
kinda on it, maybe also as a wrap, if there aren't any more questions. Look, I get it. This issue is not something that's been floating through the Ethernet, and we all probably read the same, and 8 or 9 of us on here probably all read the same documents, papers and articles every day. And that's a concern, right? Part of it is there's just a lack of attention to this. And I'm hoping with this research memo to get it up, then we're going to start, I want to say harassing, but like encouraging the administration to really take a look at NIST 800-193. And look, do I think there's guys at NIST or women and men at NIST that want to update 800-193? You bet. Do I think, they've got to argue though in prioritization for resources, where do we get this in there? This is one of those ones that needs to be pulled in. And I'm encouraged by the fact that Ann Newberg at the NSC has been pushing hard on the cyber trust mark, because I think this is integratable with that, right? An important element of the cyber trust mark would be that someone certifying both the software, the hardware, and the firmware. But to do that, you have to have a really good 800-193 document that asks hard questions about how you patch, for example, which is not dealt in depth right now, and that how you patch firmware and what the requirements are. So we've got to get that 800-193. That's the foundational document. Then the other things are helpful. We recommend some R&D investments, to look for more secure firmware methodology. We recommend the clearinghouse that I think Joseph asked about, and then finally, I think Jacob, or the first question was, do we need some legislation? We may need some legislation to kind of incentivize uptake of the right secure firmware. So, I mean, I kind of think these things is going to take a little bit of time, but we got to get started now. And believe me, the adversary now knows about this vulnerability. And I think, as they come off the sugar high of ransomware, we're going to start seeing a lot more, action in the firmware business. So, now is the time. We have a little bit of time here, but we got to use it wisely to get ourselves more secure. It's just one more piece of, one more stick on the fire of cybersecurity that's kind of raging right now.
Got it. Well, that's terrific, Mark and Michael. Thank you to you both. We don't have any more questions from those calling, so we'll take this moment to wrap it up. So thanks again for each of you for joining us today. In closing, a reminder: FDD is a nonpartisan research institute. We're focused on national security and foreign policy. We do closely monitor press@fdd.org email. So if you'd like to send us an email and request a conversation with Michael or Mark or both, we are happy to schedule that. You can go to fdd.org and find all of our research there. You will also be getting the URL for this report. The embargo lifts at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. I'll have that URL to you shortly, so you can include that in your coverage. So, Michael, Mark, thank you very much. That does conclude today's call.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, guys.